already cut that plank. The great and most important thing about the internet and the protocols that led to Unix-based communication was that there weren't complicated security and access control lists and privacy constraints put on top of it. It was precisely the simplicity of the protocols that allowed two disparate kinds of computers to talk to one another that led to this massive expansion, and the fact that every computer could be connected together, which led to ultimately a web where all different kinds of information are connected. So I claim we cut that plank a long time ago, and we basically opted for a lack of privacy, a lack of security, and exactly as you said, you know, we didn't necessarily measure, or maybe Dr. Hertzfeld did measure twice, I don't know, but
we measured more than that, but we didn't cut enough. Didn't spend enough money.
Yeah.
Thank you for your sorry.
Sure, and let me just respond to that. You're right, I mean, but there's two kinds of cuts. There's the formative cut, and there's the prohibitive cut, right? So I can make the cut to build the thing, or I can make the cut to cut it down.
Yeah.
And I think very often what tends to happen is the formative cut is the one that is usually made, and as a consequence of that cut, we do a set of measures, for example, and say, well, this is what's going to happen. And we see that, and this then speaks to the notion of the precautionary principle and its relative invalidity with regard to its anachronism. So I said, well, we're going to measure this, and we're going to cut this, and this represents a good cut. And when we do, we'll build X. We'll cut the plank, and as a consequence, this then does X, Y, and Z. And what we tend to do with that is we tend to view this very, very proximately. And as a consequence, we see the abundant benefit and a group of relative potential risks and burdens, and sometimes even some proximate or intermediate harms. The problem in making that particular cut is that it has to then evolve, and as a consequence, what then comes next may be prohibitive cuts with regard to what is recoverable, retractable, recoupable, and forgivable. Those cuts are very often more difficult to make because the measures are such, because we recognize there, what are we giving up with regard to any potential gain and or loss. So, sort of as an apologia for Charles, and a lot of these things that happen just like this, I mean, certainly my own field, neuroscience and neuroinformatics, is rife with this. The formative cut may have a number of measures, and we say, now we've done this and we see the potential benefits, and nobody in the room could doubt the benefit of the internet and what it has done in the nation of information transfer, etc. But then the prohibitive and or restrictive cuts that very often go along with the security measures are very, very difficult to engage. And that's where the measurement functions really, really come into play. And so I think it's that balance between the formative and the restrictive that needs to indeed be prudent. And the only way to do that, real pragmatism. And obviously you have to make sure that once you lay this stuff down, there are necessary guidelines to support the decisions in action.
A real short comment. I think it's important, it's true, and to the extent it is, it's important that the vast majority of compromise of information is from human behavior, deliberate usually. The secure systems fail because somebody steals a password or sells it. Be careful with your account there. Yeah. But this is a very important point, I think. It's not just an engineering problem to make the system secure. There's no engineering solution that will take care of all important failures in security. People's behavior often deliver. There are very famous events in the last year. Leaking 200,000 files is not easy, and somebody spent a lot of work on that. And that individual seems to have done it quite deliberately, and not to help anybody except himself and his friends. Now, I think one of the functions, or one of the opportunities I see in the neuroscience area is to discover instabilities in humans that lead to disastrous behavior. It may be all kinds, and we all know that all humans have some of it, and some humans have too much of it, that makes them do things that's nuts and very destructive to them. Maybe we can basically cure that or ameliorate it. So there's a small task for the future for you, but convert some more science.
We'll talk about that one over the
Yeah,
last one.
that's a bottom line conversation.
Can I follow up on that thought?
Please, sir.
Because you had said something which I think links into that I want to get Professor G and Dr. M's view on. You said, change who we are, was one of the, and if I link in the genetics issues with the nanotechnology and the cyber, are you saying that we can not just have a better understanding who we are for diagnostic medicine, but we can change who we are? Were you going down that path?
I was. One of the more contentious areas of neuroethics, and I'm throwing the term out there not to open that Pandora's box at all. We'll be here for hours on that one. But neuroethics has two traditions. The first really speaks to one of the things that Charles just mentioned: the neurological basis of moral sensibility, cognitions, emotions, and behaviors. How is it that humans engage in moral or what may be amoral or immoral activities, cognitions, etc., and why do they not? And what does that mean? It doesn't pose what the good or the bad is, but rather, how are those decisions made, enacted, and what are the emotionalities and cognitions that they go along with that? The other issue that arises from that, and may derive from that somewhat meta-ethically, is then, how do we engage particular ethical systems and approaches to intuit those decisions about the ways that neuroscientific research is utilized and applied in a variety of different spheres, inclusive of medicine, public life, and increasingly national defense, security, and intel, the focus of a conference we'll be having at George Mason next week. The latter issue there is very important because targets of accessibility also increasingly are viewed, whether correctly or incorrectly, as targets of accessibility. And as you very well know, we learned this from the human genomics and pharmacogenomics issues. The idea of identifying a viable substrate very often illustrates, at least putatively, that particular substrate then could be a representative target for X, Y, or Z, where X represents therapy, Y represents some form of enablement, and Z represents some form of enhancement, disenablement, or disability. And so clearly, one of the things we're looking at is how the cyber revolution and cyber technology may be viable towards both beneficent as well as less beneficent ends, inclusive of the capacity to not only target and understand what makes a human, and you, and me, but to then identify particular variables and substrates that may be malleable, and as such target them. Did I address your question?
Yes.
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 So the answer is yes.
So I certainly resonate with your P of pessimism. It's so hard to avoid if one is realistic about the uncertainties here. Let me add to the list of things to worry about. In addition to the misuse of information, what worries me a lot is the use of misinformation.
Right.
And I would say 99.9% of the data mining I've seen out there is actually fundamentally invalid mathematically. It leads to things like the financial crash of 2008. And so the danger of people thinking they have knowledge when they don't, gumming up the system through careless, stupid actions, I would consider one of the major dangers.
I would agree with that. I'm going to pass that off to Ashok for a moment because I know he's actually dealt with that in a security issue. But let me as introduction,
Yes.
What you're dealing with is the issue here of hard versus soft science and the problem that the internet has done to then de-silo information before it's, quote, fully baked. That's not necessarily a problem. It's a consumer issue. But what's happened is it's made florid consumerism infiltrated within what was previously the relative confines of restricted scientific rigor. And so now we can be having a scientific conversation that heretofore was very well maintained within the ivory tower. And of course in science, as you know, it's one of the few fields where you're guilty till you're proven innocent anyway. But now even partial representation of outcomes, data, result are now literally open accessed. And as a consequence, the escape from the hard, rigorous science as part of that dialectical process into the public sphere may foster certain inapt use, misappropriation, misperception, and in some cases it may actually be a florid miscommunication, and a number of reasons for that. But this represents, I think, a threat to security on a number of different levels. I'll pass the ball over to Ashok and then back to you.
But having more information is good. I mean, it all depends how you create your if-then analysis. Having less information, I believe, is more dangerous than having more information. I can understand that it can perhaps create misinformation, but then again, it depends how intelligently you develop that tree to derive the type of information you're looking for. So the tools which we are developing, it requires lots of data mining, but the key of those instruments is what we decipher, what we infer out of it is obviously meaningful, and then of course, meaningful can have two different interpretations, but in the context of what our charge is, we try to derive information which obviously we feel is relevant. And that's the reason we have the heuristic built into that, and we are consulting with our colleagues in Finland, those who have a Delphi server, essentially to access only that information which we feel is relevant to the mission.
Delphi is a very conservative system.
It is.
I guess to add on what he was saying, talking about the, I agree that a massive amount of information is better than any other,
No information.
Or going backwards. But I think kind of what he was going to is understanding the integrity of the information that you have in order to make a valid decision from that information. So that's where I think just discussing misinformation or processing misinformation, how would be a good validation that the information you're processing to make your decision have full compliance and integrity.
Trust that agrees with that.
It's part of the pragmatism step, which was the first P in that paradigm, and it's very, very difficult to enforce that level of pragmatism. I mean, you could get volumes of John Dewey, put it on the table, read it all, digest it, and in practice, pragmatism is difficult to do because of the gross availability of information, and as a consequence, weeding through that and having that level of discernment can be very arduous.
I think that, kind of to meld this with what you were talking about a little earlier on the possibility of changing us at the base level. The best way to illustrate it is there was a situation where a woman whose mother, aunt, sister, and grandmother all died of breast cancer. So the data in her mindset was clear. She was genetically predisposed to get the breast cancer gene. Instead of getting the genetic tests, which are very reliable these days, to confirm it, she went to a physician and requested a double mastectomy as a preventative approach. The data from the outset looked very clear. Every woman in her family had breast cancer. Everyone that was lived to a certain age died. She was the only one left, so clearly she is going to have breast cancer, and so she wants to preempt it by doing the double mastectomy. The physician didn't feel obligated to confirm the data from a genetic perspective because the outside data was clear enough, right? The information was very clear. Enough medicine has said that if females in your family have this, then it's good. That's good enough. We don't need to confirm any further. She got a prophylactic double mastectomy, and still, nobody really knows why she chose to go back and get the genetic test done afterwards, but she did eventually get it tested, and in fact, she did not have the gene. But when asked, do you regret that you went ahead and did this prophylactically without even double checking that this is your genetic makeup? She said no, because she was so nervous and worried that the reality was this made her feel better, even though a test beforehand would have prevented her from a double mastectomy. So the question was, should it be the medical field's duty to validate this information prior to providing any services? In some cases, I guess yes. In other cases, maybe not. if an alcoholic has a genetic propensity for alcoholism, do we pluck it out and then they're no longer an alcoholic? What does that do when we start altering our base level of DNA? I mean, do we create people who are more docile, more relaxed, that don't go out and do things like try and blow up a World Trade Center? I mean, like, do we deliberately remove moral or characteristic or behavioral traits as we figure out the sequencing that causes them? Or do we find ways to treat, if we make them medicalized, like pregnancy is now medicalized, right? Do we treat it, or do we just simply let it be and have now a database of science that says, oh, okay, if you have these genetic factors and this is your new makeup, this is what you're most likely able to do. Are there any environmental factors that may trigger this to come, or will everybody who has this makeup end up in that realm? And if so, do we marginalize them? Do we discriminate against them? Do we put them in special housing units that allow them to be these special kinds or not? The box of options, the Pandora box, is incredible, and there's a lot of concern that comes with
one
it.
obvious example of where one can get into trouble.
Yeah.
Supposing we had applied these methods to John McCain when he was a teenager. Disruptive, problematic.
Right.
Let's give him a treatment so that he becomes like the normal average person.
Yes.
Do we always want to do that?
Right. That's the question.
Yeah. And what looks good in a micro evaluation, if you knew the larger picture, it might not be so obvious what you want to do.
Exactly. Sir, beforehand in the back, yeah.
Let's start with this thinking. We start with too many unquestioned answers. Good scientists take every one to be unanswered questions. I mean, this is the doorway. Where we are now is the Lewis and Clark expedition in genetics and in neuroscience. We're just beginning to plot and understand what the landscape really is. The human genome, we think, when we describe those 3 billion bases, came out to 22,000 genes, which is about 1/5 of the number we actually have that function. So what we had to do is figure out why we weren't really thinking right about that system, because we had applied knowledge that we had before and it wasn't correct, it wasn't properly used. Most of what we have in terms of how we vary in expressing those genes has to do with how they're regulated, how the thermostats turn them on and off, how parts of them reconnect and connect to each other and make new things. And we're just beginning that understanding. So that the notion that, in fact, we can pinpoint a gene and a behavior and a future, except in a few cases, which we can really do that, is really not so. We're just beginning to get there. I think the second understanding, and I'll use the words that Jim just did, it's retractable and recoverable. The precautionary principle is inappropriate because it shuts off the ability to make progress. But a set of cautionary principles that say, let's go ahead and gingerly. Let's, as we move forward, also look at where we're also potentially making mistakes and have hazards, and take care of those as we make progress. Then the progress we make won't have a sudden backlash because we didn't do something right, because we'll know what those were. So I think the notion that we should use cautionary principles to move ahead makes a lot more sense than even discussing the precautionary principles. But I think we also have to look at the notion that where we are in these fields is still in the mapping stage, not truly understanding how everything really works. We do have pieces of knowledge which are very exciting and make us think we know about all of this, but we don't.
Let me comment to that, because your point is spot on. It actually reflects a lecture I gave last week down in Dallas. There's a lecture that I give called Neuro-Nonsense and What We Really Know About Neuroscience. And you're absolutely right. I mean, certainly neuroscience is as much of a frontier science as anyway. And as a consequence of that, we're posed with what Chalmers is referred to as the hard problem. Basically, the fundamental question of neuroscience is we're not able to get our head around efficient causality of how something like consciousness or a mind arises in and from a material substrate brain. As a consequence, what you find is that the field is laced with an axiomatic hypothetical nature and or ambiguity. And any or all of these constructs of neuroscience are then by their nature contingent, and certainly the field is iterative. well, when we begin to then combine these with other fields, what tends to happen is you then have ampliative, ambiguity, and contingencies. And one of the issues that arises from that is the knee-jerk response would be don't go forward if the risk is, and then you can finish the rest of that. That's the classic precautionary principle. In its classic sense, ein Vorsichtigprinzip. The problem with that, as you said, is that by its nature, it is contra-intuitive, it moves against the status quo of progress, and it's anachronistic. However, the cautionary construct, or sometimes referred to as the pragmatic preparatory stance, recognizes that the need to assess what we really know and what we don't, and the potentiality of the problems as well as the benefits represent a very viable stance. I mean, there's a philosophical take that I usually advance on that. It's the philosophy of the phenomenologist Hannah Arendt, and she talks about humans engaging progress as something called homo faber, which is humans as the creative, rational orienter of those who produce and create. So it's not just a question of build it and then go, uh-oh, look what we've done, but it's the necessary preparatory reflection and cautionary stance to say we are then responsible for the consequences of each and every act of innovation and intervention that indeed we incur. Certainly, what tends to happen, as you've alluded to, is that as the sciences converge, as they will, as Charles mentioned, what you then begin to see is an increased demand for that very stance to gain legs underneath it. I couldn't agree with you.
I think one should be careful to appreciate the word convergence is being a little bit misused. All of science interlaces at its fringes with almost all other kinds of science.
Agreed.
Essentially, the silos have disappeared, but they're not quite evident to everybody that they have.
Agreed.
But in essence, almost everything going on that we call science right now involves 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 disciplines. Take a look at published papers. Each of the people is in a different field. Some of them are in different states and countries. I mean, this is how science now works.
Catherine, you get the opportunity to ask the last question before we break to have some wine and cheese.
So I just wanted to point out that the Jason's group published a study in December where they recommend to DOD that they establish procedures for collection and archiving of all military personnel using samples, plan for the eventual collection of complete human genome sequence data from military personnel, and the most interesting one, I think, is determine which phenotypes are of the greatest relevance. And they do have caveats, and we should address the ethical and social issues.
That's good.
We're engineering soldiers.
Right.
That's why you have
Yeah. Thoughts from the panel?
They're not the first to come up with that. I mean, it's been done in big populations for just getting rid of old wives' tales kind of beings. Like Iceland, for example, they collected everybody's genome, and when I actually visited Iceland, one of the tour guide of the bus tour that I was taking, he was joking about the fact that everybody agreed to sign up because what they were told as kids is when the Vikings came to go to Iceland and conquer and live there, they stopped along the way and stole Celtic women on their route to Iceland, and so the Icelanders, who really believed that they were just Norwegian, actually weren't. They were a mix of Celtic and Norwegian. So when the option that the president gave to do this big genome project to see what their phenotypes were, they all agreed because they really wanted to know if that old wives' tale was true, or did they really stop off and take Celtic women. And the reality is it was true, that they were a mix of Celtic blood and Norwegian blood instead of what they thought was pure Icelandic. Pure Icelandic blood was pure Viking, pure Norwegian. So if the Icelanders can do it to find out whether what they were told as kids was true, then I guess the military can try and figure out what are the best soldiers. They will address those ethical issues, definitely.
Ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, let's have a round of applause for our panel. Second, a reminder, our next session is going to be the 30th of March, ethical, legal, social. I think we've whetted the appetite with a lot of the issues today. And more than anything else, let's continue to rub our brains together over a drink and some food next time. Thank you very much.